Good morning, everybody. Merry Christmas, and welcome to the Liturgy of the Chalice. I'm so glad you're here with me this morning to celebrate the birth and life of Jesus. This morning on Christmas Eve, we're going to begin talking about the birth and life of Jesus, and then tomorrow on Christmas morning, we'll continue with part 2 of the birth and life of Jesus. Let's begin. So what do we know historically about Jesus? We should be able to distinguish between legend and probable historical teachings of Jesus in the Christian Testament and other sources. It is often hard to distinguish between fact and fiction when it comes to the lives of great avatars and famous sages in all religions. Often their life stories handed down to us through the scriptures are a mixture of historical facts and sacred legends. Legends and myths are important. There are symbolic meanings for these myths and legends, and those who meditate beyond the surface level can gain great wisdom by them. This was done a lot by the Christian Gnostics, and I specify Christian Gnostics because the Gnostic tradition far predated anything that could be labeled Christian. There was the Greek Gnosis, there was early Jewish Gnosis, and then from that came Christian Gnosis. And the Christian Gnostics made quite a bit about the legends and the symbols, both in the Old and the New Testaments, which are very interesting to study. Perhaps at a future time we'll study more of those things at an appropriate time. Non-biased biblical scholars understand and teach that there are no historical records of the birth and youth of the Master Jesus, Mar Yeshua. We do know when he was likely crucified with probable great accuracy. Thus, we know the probable date range of his sacred birth, or we can guess a probable likely date range for his holy birth. We know, based off of scriptural evidence, I know that many people would argue that there's no evidence in Scripture, but the Scriptures tell us that there was Holy Thursday, where he had the Last Supper, so to speak, or the last Jewish Seder, offering bread and wine to God. And then on Friday, he was crucified, and he was taken down from the cross before twilight, because any execution had to be done before Shabbat began. And Shabbat, or the Sabbath, begins at nightfall on Friday. And then he was buried. He was already dead and buried before Shabbat began and the official Passover or Pesach celebrations began. Then he was in the tomb Saturday and purportedly rose on the third day, Sunday morning or Easter morning. So we have an idea of days when he would be leaving his body. And according to scriptures, it would have been on a Friday. The Friday prior to Shabbat beginning at nightfall, when Pesach would have began, Passover, when they would offer the Passover lamb and celebrate in various ways. So historically, based off of all the evidence we know, we can place the exact crucifixion date at April 3rd, AD 33, due to biblical references and astronomical data. So April 3rd, AD 33 was a Friday. It would have fit the bill. And many people say that Jesus, at least Luke proclaims that Jesus started his ministry when he was 30. And the scriptures, including John, which really works as a liturgical calendar, shows that he taught for 3 years before he was executed. So myth and legend has it that Jesus died at age 33. So this date kind of fits in. How did we come to this date, Friday, April 3rd, AD 33? In Acts 2:20, we see, "The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day." The Lord's glorious day is the day of his resurrection. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood describes a lunar eclipse seen here to the left. Modern astronomical software can easily calculate past lunar eclipses with mathematical accuracy. Myth has it that Jesus died at the age of 33, which is probably not true. Jesus is called Rabbi by both his disciples and other Jewish Pharisees in the Christian Testament. In the time of Jesus, no one received the title of Rabbi or Mar in Aramaic, meaning master, until the age of 50, approximately. Therefore, we cannot know the year Jesus was born for sure, or how many years he lived. Historically, we can only say when he likely died, in the time frame of when his life was supposed to be situated on the earth. All accounts, however, claim that Miriam, Mary of Nazareth, was Jesus' mother, and that Joseph, or Yusuf, Joseph of Nazareth, was his father. The canonical Gospels were based on the earlier written Pauline epistles, the letters of Paul, and were developed by presbyters. Presbyter is an elder, and there was also a female form of presbyter. And these male and female elders were proto-priests before a priest really came into being as it is today. And they were developed not only by these presbyters or elders, these priests, but by traveling prophets in early home churches. Because back in those days there were no Gothic churches or large churches or mega churches like you see today. People would gather in each other's homes. And that's what this tradition mainly does. We gather in people's homes. Right now I'm in my home. And we also gather in some public places too, for special occasions nearby. Whenever I travel to visit people, we also rent a small space, consecrate it, and then do the liturgy of the Chalice, or the sacrament of Shabbat, or some other sacramental work in a consecrated space. It's interesting to note that Paul said nothing about the birth and life of Jesus. And this is because he did not know anything about the birth and life of Jesus. Jesus never met Paul. Paul never met Jesus. The Pauline epistles were written about 50, 60 AD, and that's approximately 20 years or more after the death of Christ. So Paul, as we know the story goes, he was persecuting the early Christians. And he was a very rabid Pharisee against the Christians, the Jewish Christians, or the Jewish people that were following Jesus' teachings, and proclaiming certain things about about Jesus that didn't resonate with Jews. And I agree with a lot of those dissonances, but I don't agree with Paul's methods. But anyway, Paul never met Jesus. He had this vision on the road to Damascus. He saw a great light, and that light claimed to be Jesus, according to Paul. And then Paul developed his Christology, Gentile Christianity, which became the modern Orthodox Christian churches. He developed his Christology and his ideas about how Jesus saves people through mystical visions that he had, that he thought or perceived came from Jesus. And this is very different from Palestinian Christianity or Jewish Christianity that developed in Jerusalem, led by James the Just, the biological brother of Jesus, after Jesus died. So in the Gospel of Thomas, the disciples say something like, "Whenever you're not around, who will lead us?" And Mar Yeshua says that this whole earth was made for James the Just, and you should go to him for spiritual guidance when I'm not here. And the Gospel of Thomas isn't the only source in ancient times that tells us that James the Just was the first bishop, the first successor of Jesus in Jerusalem. So after Jesus' death, James took over the spiritual guidance of the disciples of Jesus and the apostles. And he oversaw them. He was kind of like an archbishop, so to speak, or even the first pope, historically speaking. Legend says that it was Peter, but it wasn't. And we see this from many early records in the early letters and writings of the early church fathers. Eusebius talks a lot about James the Just being the first bishop, etc., in Jerusalem. So this group led by James the Just preserved Jesus' teachings with a Jewish understanding. Either early Jewish Christianity was either similar to or the same as what's called the Ebionites. And the Ebionites also preserved different traditions about Jesus. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So the Gentile Christians led by Paul did not teach the same things that the disciples of Jesus taught. The people that lived with Jesus, walked with Jesus, heard him speak and teach. And they were all Jews and understood that Jesus was not creating a new religion, but he was trying to reestablish a new Jewish covenant with the people of Israel. So the apostles and Jesus, for the most part, at least in the beginning, were speaking to a Jewish audience. And Jesus was a Jew. All the apostles were Jews. They practiced the Jewish religion, but they practiced it in the light of Jesus' halakha, or Jesus' teachings. Paul did not meet Jesus. In one letter, he says he never even met an apostle. He said that he just received his teachings from mystical visions or mystical revelations. I'm not saying that mystical revelations aren't possible, that divine guidance can't happen internally. I do believe it can. But who would you trust? Somebody that says he is getting teachings from Jesus beyond the grave, or people that lived with Jesus, were taught by the living Jesus? It's obvious that at least the historical teachings of Jesus were preserved by the Jewish Christians, the Palestinian Christians, led by James the Just in Jerusalem. But in the end, we can't go into it too much deeper. I wanted to accentuate that difference so you understand what happens later on in this talk. Paul's version 1. The Catholic Church persecuted the Ebionites, which may have even been the Palestinian Christians, and they also persecuted any other sect of Christianity that developed, because the Catholic Church wanted to claim it was the one original church. But it wasn't. There were many churches in the beginning, and it's clear. I mean, all you have to do is read the Pauline Letters, and it says that James the Just, Peter and John ran the church in Jerusalem, and Paul ran the church for the Gentile nations outside of Israel. Paul brought Jesus, so to speak, inauthentically so, but he did bring Jesus to the nations outside of Israel. And the nations outside of Israel, the people outside of Israel, were called Gentiles. So Paul was a Pharisee. He did understand Jewish ways. That's apparent by reading his epistles and the Acts of the Apostles, which is mostly about Paul's adventures. But Paul distorted Jesus' teachings. He didn't even know Jesus' teachings. When you read all the letters of Paul, there is not even one quote of Jesus' teachings in it. In the Acts of the Apostles, you see Paul quoting one line from Jesus. It is better to give than to receive. He quotes that line. But Paul made up a religion about Jesus. He wanted to make Jesus worshipped. And what we have to understand is that a Jewish master would never seek to be worshipped or made equal to God. And that's what happened with the evolution of Christianity. The Christianity that exists today would be blasphemous to Mar Yeshua as a Jewish Rav or a Jewish master, a proto-rabbi, if you will. So Paul made a religion about Jesus, saying if you believed in his death and resurrection, you'll be reborn. And this is stuff that really resonated with the Mediterranean mystery religions that were circulating all in that area around Israel, where there's a lot of dying and rising gods. There were many of them. And Paul made Jesus to be a dying and rising God so that he could be marketed properly to the Gentile communities so that they could accept him. Notice in the letters of Paul how Paul got rid of all kosher food laws. He got rid of circumcision. He got rid of everything and anything that made one a Jew. And he made his own new religion that worked in the Roman Empire for the various Mediterranean mystery religions that were going on at that time. He made the Jewish Jesus into a Mediterranean Romanesque God. And he didn't teach even one of his teachings in the Pauline Letters. Not even one. But it is Jesus' teachings. It is doing the teachings. It is embodying the teachings that births the Christ within us. That's what Christmas is about. We don't know when Jesus was born. The 25th is an honorary date. As we'll learn tomorrow, it couldn't possibly be the December 25th. But yet, there was a day that we don't know when this holy, divine, sacred Jewish master came to earth via the Holy Mary and his father Joseph. And through this being who was one with God consciousness, he gave us easy to do teachings that purify our minds and our hearts, that symbolically make us reborn. We get this birth from above, as described by the Gospel of John. We go from the first Adam to the second Adam. The first Adam is selfish, concerned only for itself. If it's spiritual, it's only quoting off verses with no embodiment, no true wisdom that is embodied or enacted in the world. But by doing Jesus' teachings, we become transformed from the old Adam, the first Adam, to the second Adam, which is called the Baranash, the Son of Mankind, collective Messiah. Any of Jesus' disciples, past, present, or future, that embody his teachings will birth the Christ within them. They will manifest their own Christmas at that time. Jesus would love for all of us to become like he actually was, not what Paul contorted him into being. And everything Paul made him to be would have been blasphemous to Jesus and to all Jews. And that's why many Jews have not accepted Jesus as a teacher, as a prophet, which is really sad because Jesus was amongst the greatest of Jewish prophets. And when you understand his teachings truly, you understand them in their Jewish context. Let's continue because I can belabor this for quite some time. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel, and probably most authentic, does not give the virgin birth legend or speak of any events in Jesus' childhood. It starts with his adult baptism, mikvah, by John the Baptist. This shows that some of the earliest Christians did not know of a virgin birth legend. This does not mean that one was not circulating in other Jesus traditions that may have been developing concurrently. So let's look at the genealogies of Jesus. If we're going to find anything historical about Jesus's lineage, then we have to look at the genealogies, or the listing of this person is the son of this person is the son of that person is the son of this one, in both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. So the goal of the genealogies of Jesus portrayed in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, as well as all the infancy stories of Jesus, were designed to prove that Jesus was the expected Davidic Messiah, the King of the Jews. This was done for doctrinal, theological, and eschatological reasons of the early developing church, and little, if any of it, was historical. Jesus did not identify as the Davidic Messiah, but rather satirized it. He self-identified as a Jewish prophet. So in Mark 12:35 through 37, Jesus says, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord, Adonai, Yahweh, said to my Lord, the Messiah, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him Lord, the Messiah. So how can he be his son?" So the Davidic Messiah was this warrior king thought to descend from the clouds with the angels, and they would slaughter all the enemies of Israel, reestablish both Israel and Jerusalem, and they would restore Israel both politically and spiritually. And this Davidic Messiah was thought to be a man that would be born through the lineage of King David, of Hebrew Testament fame, David and Goliath, etc. But David says here, Jesus says David himself calls him Lord, the Messiah. So how can he be his son? In other words, King David is the king of all of Israel at that time, or at least the southern kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah. But how can King David call his son a subordinate Lord? So Jesus is using this to disprove the idea of the Messiah being the son of David. Because how can King David be subordinate to anybody? How can he call his son Lord, raise his son above himself? This is the kind of reasoning Jesus uses to dispute, to contradict the idea of the Davidic Messiah. Because Jesus taught the Son of Man Messiah, the Son of Mankind Messiah, which is called the Baranash in Aramaic. And when you learn about this through the book of Daniel, the books of Enoch, the books of Isaiah, you learn that the Son of Man Messiah was an anointed corporate Messiah, meaning that it was a communion of saints. The Messiah, according to Jesus and taught by Jesus, when properly understood, was a purified, spiritualized, new humanity, a second Adam. In the Gospel of Thomas, Logian 3, Jesus says, If those who try to exert spiritual influence over you say, 'Behold the Malkuth, the kingship of God, will descend from the sky,' then the birds of the sky will be greater than you in the Malkuth. If they say to you, 'Behold the Malkuth, the kingship of God, will arise from the sea,' then the fish will be greater than you. But the Malkuth, the kingship, the rulership, the sovereignty of God, is within your heart and beyond your understanding." So when Jesus says, "Behold, the Malkuth will descend from the sky," he's satirizing the idea of a Davidic Messiah, because the Davidic Messiah, the warrior king, was thought to descend from the clouds in a misinterpretation of the book of David, and that he would come with angels and they would wipe out all the opposition, the Roman occupancy, etc., that was plaguing Israel at the time. So, if that messianic expectation is true, then the birds of the sky will be greater than you because they'll experience the Davidic Messiah first. So he's making fun of the Davidic Messiah here. And then he says, if they say to you, "Behold, the Malkuth will arise from the sea," then the fish will be greater than you. Because there was more than one messianic expectation. The Christians they only talk about this son of David, this Davidic Messiah. And they try to conflate that with the corporate or collective Messiah, the Baranash, the Son of Mankind collective Messiah. And they are two different things. Jesus is saying clearly here in Mark and Thomas that he does not believe in, does not advocate for, does not teach or approve of the Davidic Messiah. So it's quite apparent that the Davidic Messiah is not the same thing as the Son of Man. But Orthodox churches try to teach it that way, which is non-historical and incorrect. Like much of the other so-called Christian teachings. So, "Behold, the Malkuth will arise from the sea" refers to the Messiah ben Joseph, who is thought to be a great, wise, martyr Messiah. He was a wise Messiah that would teach truth and he'd be killed for it. So he was kind of like a suffering servant or a suffering Messiah. And it's apparent, and one could say, "Oh, well, Jesus died on the cross. Doesn't that make sense?" He did die for truth, or what he felt was the truth. But here Jesus is also satirizing the Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering servant. In other words, he does not identify with it. He is not teaching this concept. He's saying that if the Messiah ben Joseph was the Messiah, then the fish will be greater than you, because the fish would experience this being rising from the sea first, before humanity. Jesus says the Malkuth, the kingship of God, is within your heart and beyond your understanding. All of Jesus' teachings were about purifying our hearts, opening our hearts, softening our hearts, letting God's rulership enter our hearts. And when this process in thought, word, and deed was completed, it would be a kind of Christmas. We would be reborn as a Christ ourselves. And we become part of the second Adam. The second humanity, literally, is what the second Adam means. And this is an anointed, new, spiritualized humanity of God that serves God here on earth and other higher spiritual spheres. Let's close by looking at these genealogies, and then we'll continue tomorrow with some gospel stories about the birth of Jesus and other infancy stories. So here, I give credit here to presiding Bishop Louis Kaiser. This comes from one of his presentations. And in it, he sets the genealogy of Jesus of Matthew here on the right, Matthew 1, verses 1 through 17. And on the left, we see the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, 23 through 38. So what is in red is proposed to be probably historical or partially historical. And they are very different. There can't be two true stories. So somebody is wrong, or they're both wrong. Or they're just trying to prove a story based off of characters you would find in the Hebrew Testament. And this becomes very important to the early Christians. The early Christians at first were a persecuted religion. Not for long, but for some time in the beginning. And they were new amongst many ancient Mediterranean religions and Middle Eastern religions. Judaism was a very old, ancient tradition. And the new Christians wanted to anchor and validate their newly created religion, created by Paul, by proving that Jesus was foretold through the old scriptures of the Hebrew Bible. And tomorrow we'll go through a whole bunch of proof texts. There was a lot of proof texts, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew tried to prove that Jesus was the expected Davidic Messiah, which is not true. But anyhow, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide on the screen, there's a major difference in disagreement about how Jesus became linked to the Davidic lineage, how Jesus would be the coming Davidic Messiah. So Matthew claims that Jesus was descended through Solomon, King Solomon. And in Luke, Jesus descended through Nathan, David's other son, who was not a king. So let's look at basically just the red. The red may be historical, and it gives some really interesting historical links. So here, coming over here to the left, we see Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah so on. So it's very important to trace Jesus' lineage through Jacob, down through Jacob's son, Judah, and his brothers. Because Judah, from the line, or the progeny of Judah, would emerge King David. So by saying that Jesus that his ancestry began with Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, onward down to King David, which we see here in red, he is trying to establish that Jesus was of Davidic lineage, that he was eligible of being the Davidic Messiah, this warrior king. So here in red we see David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So here Jesus' lineage is traced through King Solomon and King Solomon's progeny. What is interesting is that we see this thing of David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph. Abijah is very interesting in the Hebrew Testament because he was a Levitical priest. From the tribe of Levi was where the Jewish priesthood came from. The authorized, accepted Jewish priesthood, if you will. So here, they're trying to claim that not only was Jesus eligible to be the Davidic Messiah, but that Jesus was also of Levitical origin, that he was a priest, that he could pass down the priesthood from Melchizedek down to us, etc., to offer bread and wine on the altar that you see here during the liturgy of the chalice. According to Matthew, we get that privilege through apostolic succession, through the lineage of Abijah. Later on, we see in this long lineage of names, the son of 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 so on and so forth, we see Zerubbabel, which is very interesting because it's something that agrees. Both Matthew and Luke say that Jesus' lineage traveled through Zerubbabel, who was a stonemason in the Hebrew Testament. Often we say that Jesus and Joseph were carpenters, which is a mistranslation of the Greek word tekton. Tekton actually means stonemason. So what's really interesting is that it would agree. Zerubbabel, but back then, trades like stonemasonry traveled through family lineages, and the father would teach the eldest son, and then so on and so forth down to the generations. So here it talks about the family trade. So it's highly historical that Jesus and Joseph before him were stonemasons, and that was their job on earth. So, as we'll see tomorrow, it's almost historically assured that Jesus was a Levite. I am not against Jesus being of Davidic lineage. He might have been to the lineage of David. That might be true. But Jesus himself said he was not the Davidic Messiah, that he did not like the idea of the Davidic Messiah, that the idea of the Davidic Messiah did not make sense, as we've already covered. So I can accept, based off of tradition, that Jesus may have been of Davidic lineage. But the whole purpose of these lineages, and the birth story of Jesus and the infancy stories of Jesus, they were all developed. They're all not historical, and they were developed to prove that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, when he himself said he didn't believe in the Davidic Messiah, and therefore did not self-identify as such. Jesus identified as a prophet, and likely he identified as a priest. It's true. We'll go over it tomorrow. So finally down here we see that there's another Jacob. Jacob, this is a second Jacob, not ancient Jacob from the beginning of the genealogy. But he claims that Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah, the Davidic Messiah. Now here, we see that Jesus was the son of Joseph. Isn't that interesting? That they say he was the son of Joseph, not the son of God, right? Slip of the tongue. But Jesus was the son of Joseph, who was the son of Heli, or Eli. So here, both accounts agree that Joseph was the father, or Yusuf was the father of Jesus, but they disagree on who the father of Joseph was. Luke says that Heli was the father of Joseph, and Matthew says that Jacob was the father of Joseph. So there's some disagreement here, but both accounts agree that Joseph was the father of Jesus. So it's probably historical. And we already talked about Zerubbabel, that the lineage, both the Matthean lineage and the Lucan lineage, traces through Zerubbabel, who was a stonemason. So this proves that the trade of Jesus' family and his lineage was in masonry, which is very interesting because stonemasons were allowed to travel from area to area unforbidden throughout the Roman Empire and throughout Babylon and throughout the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. So that's very important to know because it's highly likely that Jesus did travel around. His teachings resemble a lot of other teachings. And although Christians want to think that Jesus only taught Christianity, that area of the world is a big melting pot. It's possible that Jesus traveled to Babylon to study there the Babylonian messianic expectation, which was, of course, the Son of Man Messiah, this communion of saints idea, this anointed new humanity. Because all the scriptures that came from the Babylonian exile were the book of Daniel, the books of Enoch, the books of Isaiah. Yes, I say books because the book of Isaiah, as it's presented in the Bible, is really three parts from three different times in history, all lumped together. And those sources are the sources where Jesus got his Son of Man kind Messiah speculation from. Here also it says that, the son of Joshua, the son of Eliezer, the son of Jorim, the son of Matat, the son of Levi. So again, here it's trying to prove that Jesus was not only of Davidic lineage, but that he was of Levitic lineage. Being of the Levitic lineage, he would be a priest. And then down here we see a disagreement. Here we see that Jesus is traced through Nathan, the son of David, that is King David. So although both agree that Jesus descended through King David, they disagree as to whether it was through David's son Solomon or David's son Nathan. And honestly, this does bring up speculation as to whether it happened at all, as to whether he was Davidic or not. Both agree in general and without disagreeing with each other that he was born through Levitic lineage, but they have different ideas of how he came down through Davidic lineage. And again, I'm not saying that he wasn't of Davidic lineage. He quite possibly was. But again, he did not identify as the Davidic Messiah. And then finally, they trace Jesus back to Adam, the so-called first man, the Son of God. So that's how they trace his lineage. So the idea here, and where we'll end for today, and we'll pick up tomorrow morning, on Christmas morning, is that the whole purpose of Jesus' birth stories, his genealogies, his virgin birth, and all the infancy stories around it are not historical. And they were all developed to prove that Jesus was the expected Davidic Messiah, which we've already proved that Jesus did not accept the Davidic Messiah. So all these stories trying to prove him to be that are at least partially non-historical, if not totally non-historical. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow on Christmas morning. Let's continue with the Liturgy of the Chalice.